We are back at it again, fantasy fans. It's a brand new season, and that means a fresh start for all us wannabe team principals. Another chance for glory, another chance for Ferrari to break our fragile little hearts. We've got a lot to cover in the next 15 minutes. We need to have a look at the latest driver viability matrix. We need to talk about individual points targets. And I want to have a little fireside chat about risk versus reward going into the first race of the season. Play the intro. What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to the Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insight. As you can see, we've also got a new livery for 2023. I hope you like it. For anyone on mobile, don't forget you can get even closer to the data using the old pinch to zoom action. Quick disclaimer before we get into the video. I would like to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with Formula 1 or the official F1 fantasy game. I'm just an Excel nerd with a microphone, and I'm on a mission to build a community of hardcore fantasy fans here on YouTube. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, feel free to subscribe to the channel and switch on notifications to make sure you never miss an upload. Now we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, I don't know about you, but at this point I'm actually kind of nervous about who I'm picking for the first race of the season. Obviously I'll be leaning on the driver viability matrix to tell me who's actually worth considering based on the data, but there's a lot of unknowns going into Bahrain, and for me, pre-season testing kind of introduced some additional uncertainty. Drivers like Lando Norris or Nick De Vries, who were absolutely part of my strategy 2 weeks ago, are now kind of looking like less attractive assets based on the lackluster performances from McLaren and AlphaTauri. More so than usual, pre-season testing has kind of left me confused, and I feel like there's a lot we don't know, and with all that uncertainty comes doubt. Doubt leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate is the path to the dark side. Now, I'm not claiming to be the Yoda of fantasy F1, but I have developed a formula that I want to share with you that will, I think, help you find some solid ground and enable you to make some decisions in spite of all the unknowns. To the driver viability matrix. Right, there are obviously a few old faces we need to remove, and there's a few new faces we need to add, but let's start by looking at who we can immediately drop from selection with a certain degree of confidence heading into qualifying. Yuki was, and he still is, a hard pass because I didn't see anything in pre-season testing that suggests he is going to reverse the trend. So, based on the data, Yuki will not be making the shortlist for Bahrain. Zhou is the same. I really like Zhou, and for me, Alpha have made some decent gains since the end of last season, so I'm hopeful we'll see Zhou fight his way back into the pack this year, but going into Bahrain, he is still a hard pass. Daniel and Latifi are gonzo, so we'll fade them out. Now, Pierre is an interesting one because based on his results from last year, he was a hard pass, but things could be different this year. Pierre in pink might be a recipe for perfection. The data doesn't support it yet, but I'm not going to argue with anyone who adds Pierre into their lineup based on their feelings. I love Pierre and I desperately want to see him succeed with Alpine. Our last big pass based on the data is Lando. Now, I was really hoping to see something compelling in pre-season testing that would justify us taking a tactical risk with Lando. But for the second year in a row now, McLaren not really hooking it up. So until we see proof that McLaren are on the rise, I think Lando will have to sit on the sidelines. Okay, let's add in the rookies, and this might be a controversial statement, but for me, none of the rookies are making the shortlist, and that's simply because we have no data. Now, I will say this, at a cool 5 million, Nick De Vries do be looking like a tasty snack, and technically, we do have a single data point from when he stepped in to cover for Alex at the Italian Grand Prix last year. So if you're happy taking a risk with De Vries, it could pay off big time because with big risk comes big reward, and I wouldn't be surprised if Nick proved to be the back marker to have in your team this year. I always try to make decisions based on data, and because we don't have any data, we can't baseline any of the rookies. In order to be consistent, I do have to add Nico in down here as well. Obviously we have historic data for Nico, but I don't think we could put much stock into that at this point. Because Nico is cheaper, he will feature in teams, no doubt about it. He's currently being selected by 19% of team principals, but I think that's primarily driven by necessity rather than choice. Okay, once we fade out Mick and Seb, we're now left with 12 drivers, and the last thing we need to talk about before moving on to the shortlist is Lance, or more specifically, Lance's seat. Just a little behind the scenes, I'm actually recording this video on Tuesday the 27th of February because I'm going on holiday to Tifosi Land on the 1st of March. I'll actually still be in Rome for the first race of the season, which will be amazing if Ferrari win. But at the point of recording this video, it's not clear if it's going to be Lance or Felipe in the seat this weekend. Now, what I'm going to propose might also be seen as controversial, especially considering how fast Aston Martin are looking, but I'm going to say it doesn't matter. If it's Felipe, then he's a hard pass for the same reason we're passing on Nick, Oscar, Logan and Nico. And if it's Lance, then I think you have to ask yourself, how bad are his injuries? Is he race fit? Is the new car going to work for him? In either scenario, there's too many unknowns, so I don't think it matters if it's Lance or Felipe, neither driver is making the shortlist. So that means we've eliminated 9 drivers: Yuki, Zhou, Pierre, Lando, Nick, Oscar, Logan, Nico, and either Lance or Felipe. You can of course disagree and put any one of those 9 drivers in your lineup. Please sound off in the comments if you do, because I'd love to hear what your reasoning is. The 2 drivers I am personally really tempted to include are Pierre or Nick, because I think year on year, enough has changed for Pierre that it could be worth a gamble. And according to Christian Horner, Nick De Vries is potentially Max Verstappen 2.0, but we've still got 11 super viable options, and I don't see Pierre or Nick winning at the weekend. So in the interest of keeping things moving, I'm going to leave them where they are. Okay, so the drivers we need to look at in more detail are Max, Charles, George, Sergio, Lewis, Carlos, Esteban, Nerfando, who needs to be green, Alex, Valtteri Bottas, and K-Mag. Now comes the really hard part, and this is where I wish the cost cap was 300 million, because now we need to get from a list of 11 options to a team of 5 drivers. Let's start with the defending World Driver Champion Max Verstappen. Now, Max's stats looking super tasty, however his price tag is eye-watering. Now, that's not surprising, he is a defending World Champion and he did average 41 points per race last season, so of course he's going to set you back. Going into Bahrain, anyone picking Max should be targeting at least 21 points, and with the removal of the £20 million cost cap on the DRS boost, formerly known as the Turbo Driver token, you could realistically target up to 42 points with Max. Now if that feels a touch low, one thing I would draw your attention to is that Red Bull had the dreaded double DNF last year at Bahrain, so both Max and Sergio's targets are being somewhat limited by those lower scores. In the interest of providing an alternative target, the average score of a race winner in 2022 was 51 points, so if you use your DRS boost on Max, he could score you as many as 102 points by the time we see the checkered flag. Next up is Charles, and his stats are looking really good. I think most people are going to have to choose between Max or Charles, because anyone putting both of these drivers in their lineup is spending 48% of their budget on 28% of their team. Anyone looking at Charles for Bahrain should be targeting at least 38 points or 76 points if you use your DRS boost. Thinking about the season on the whole, I think if anyone is going to stop Max from becoming a back-to-back-to-back world champion, it's Charles. And I believe that Ferrari are coming to Bahrain with a race-winning package, but is that enough to convince you to add Charles to your lineup? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Next up we have George, and George was Mr. Consistent last year because he averaged 30 points per race, and if you ignore Silverstone, Singapore and Japan, he always scored at least 26 points. That level of reliability is vitally important in fantasy. This weekend, George is priced at 18.6 million, and anyone picking him should be targeting either 29 or 58 points, depending on if you want to use your DRS boost. Up next we have Sergio, who has a very compelling stat sheet at a very attractive price point. Priced at a cool 18 million flat, anyone picking Sergio should be targeting at least 21 points or 42 points if you want to use your DRS boost. As we've already said, Sergio and Max's point targets are being hampered by the double DNF from last year. I think what we said for Max is also true for Sergio, and to be fair, it's also true for Leclerc. Whoever wins this weekend is going to score close to 51 points, so if you use your DRS boost on the winner, there's over 100 points up for grabs. It could be Max or Charles, it could also just as easily be Sergio. I suppose the question is, do you think Red Bull are going to make a big statement in the first race of the season? If you think they are, how high are you willing to push your concentration risk? Are you going to run with Red Bull as your constructor, Max as your DRS boosted driver with Sergio locking out your front row? Up next we have Lewis, who is potentially overpriced at 23.7 million just based on the performance of the Mercedes. If you are bringing him into your team, you can confidently target 29 points or 58 points if you use your DRS boost. I would really love to hear from anyone who is putting Lewis in their team for Bahrain, because yes, Lewis is the GOAT, that's not up for debate. But what I'd love to know is, what makes you so sure that Mercedes are going to be in the fight from week 1? Over the course of the season, I do expect we'll see Lewis and George on the podium on more than one occasion, and I do think Mercedes will be able to fight for wins, but the data doesn't really support putting Lewis in at this stage because you're investing 24% of your budget on the second most expensive driver, who was ultimately outscored by 3 cheaper options in 2022. Up next is Carlos, and Carlos is probably the last driver you might consider using your DRS boost on. So we'll dive into Carlos, then we'll do the next 5 rapid fire. Carlos's stat sheet looks really good. I'd say his price is fair. He's the 6th most expensive driver on the grid, and where he finished P6 in the FTC last year, that 17.7 million feels about right. Obviously, Ferrari had the 1-2 last year in Bahrain, and the Ferrari package does look competitive, so it's super realistic to say that Carlos will be in the mix. Anyone putting him in their lineup should aim for at least 26 points or 52 points if you use your DRS boost. Okay, we'll run through the next 5 and then I'll wrap up the video by sharing my picks for anyone who wants to hear them. Up next is Esteban, and again his price is very fair. He finished P8 in the FTC last year and he's the 8th most expensive driver at 9.4 million. One thing you need to consider is the whole Esteban-Pierre equation. Theoretically, they'll qualify fairly close to each other, which means they'll be in a similar position on track. Is that a recipe for disaster, or will things work themselves out? Assuming he finishes the race, Esteban should be able to add at least 17 points to your tally. Nerfando and his rocket-powered Aston Martin were the real surprise from pre-season testing. At the point of recording this video, Nerfando is already in 68% of people's teams, so he is literally the most popular driver. And popularity is something you need to consider when making a decision. Because even if something goes very wrong and you end up dropping points because of Nerfando, if 68% of the fantasy paddock have picked him, yes, you're losing points, but you're not losing ground. Nerfando's target for this weekend is 10 points. Up next is Alex, who was more often than not king of the back markers in 2022. It was either Alex or K-Mag, sometimes Mick, but Alex definitely looking like a viable pick for Bahrain. Alex finished P14 last year in the FTC, and this year he's the 14th most expensive driver, so again that's 1-to-1, which essentially justifies his £5.5 million price tag. Alex's target this weekend is 8 points. Second to last, now we have Valtteri Bottas, who on his day is a point-scoring machine, but it's not unfair to say that Valtteri is a risky asset because he finished P20 on 3 separate occasions in 2022, and he was one of only 3 drivers to clock back-to-back P20s. Technically slightly out of position, Valtteri is the 11th most expensive driver and he finished P12 in 2022, so he's marginally overpriced at 7.8 million, but for that investment you can target 13 points. Last but not least, we have K-Mag, and we are now firmly in the bottom half of the table, but the Haas is looking very tasty, and Kevin had an incredible season last year. He averaged 7 points per race, he took his maiden pole, and he scored double-digit points finishes on 9 separate occasions. There's always a risk with the back markers because Kevin did clock a negative score on 5 separate occasions, and that's something you want to avoid if you can, but targeting 14 points for 6.7 million, if you're happy signing up for a moderate amount of risk, could be a very fair exchange. Okay, that's all the drivers we've shortlisted for a deep dive. If you want me to cover the constructors as well in a similar fashion, let me know in the comments. I don't think people really ever change their constructor, and if they do, they just swap between Red Bull and Ferrari, right? But I would be happy to get into the constructors as well if people want to see it. What I'd like to do now is just kind of take a seat by the fire and talk you through what I'm thinking going into Bahrain, so less data, more opinion from here on out. At this point, I kind of feel like anyone not selecting Red Bull as their constructor is either playing a very dangerous game, aka big risk, big reward, or they're blinded by hate. I think picking Red Bull now gives you the flexibility to reallocate funding later on in the season if you need to, and if you look at the constructor results from last year, Red Bull was so dominant. P1 in 13 out of 22 races, top 3 in 20 out of 22 races. Love them or hate them, I feel like I almost have to pick Red Bull because again, it's the popularity play. Where I need to be careful is double stacking and increasing my concentration risk beyond what I think is an acceptable threshold. Red Bull, Max and Sergio will cost you 72.4 million, and if you'd have run with them for the 2022 Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, you'd have been a genius because you'd have scored 205 points. But if you'd have run with the same lineup for Bahrain last year, you'd be an idiot because then you'd have only scored 13 points. At this point, I think I am locking in Red Bull as my constructor, and I think the new relaxed rules for DRS boost mean you almost have to put Max in your team, and you kind of have to make him your DRS boosted driver because even if Max had a bad qualifying session like he did in Hungary last year, where he started P10, you'd have still wanted to have him as your DRS boosted driver because he ultimately won the race. So having Red Bull and Max as a kind of stationary asset seems inevitable at this point. Maybe something will happen that make me rethink that, but at this point it feels fairly locked in. I've definitely got my eye on Carlos. I think Carlos represents good value at 17.2 million. I would of course prefer to have Charles, but with Max and Red Bull, Charles is kind of out of reach. There is a config I found where I can get Charles in, but I need to run with De Vries, and as I said earlier, I think including Nick is a big risk. Nefando is a clear pick. I think anyone sleeping on Nefando is mad. I'm almost surprised he's only 8.3 million. I did read they were waiting on the results of pre-season testing to determine the final prices, and it seems like maybe the results didn't influence the pricing as much as you would have thought they would, because Fernando is 8.3 million and Lando is 11.2. It almost feels like they're the wrong way round. At this point, I think I'm either going to go with Max, Charles, Fernando, Alex, Nick, and then Red Bull and Haas, which would be a total cost of 99.4 million, or I'm going to go with Max, Carlos, Fernando, Pierre, and Kevin, with Red Bull and Williams. In both cases, I'm having to pass over Mercedes, which doesn't feel super good. Config 1 is essentially no Kevin but Haas, and Config 2 is no Alex but Williams. In either scenario, I've got second-hand exposure to a driver I've labelled as not eligible for selection, so that's not ideal. But it's also a very comparable risk, so it's kind of what's the better pairing, Charles and Nick or Carlos and Pierre? I'm not sure what I'm going to do at this point. I'll post my final selection on Twitter, so follow me there if you want an update, @TheDataStraight. In closing for real this time, we're back, baby. I think some of the changes look really good. I'm really excited to see how the chips mechanic will affect the gameplay over the course of the season. I do think they may have nerfed our desire to tinker with the new rules. They've definitely limited our ability to tinker because now we only get to make 2 subs plus 1 if you carry it over from the previous week, so we'll see. Post your teams in the comments down below. Let me know who you're backing for maximum points this weekend. And if you're still with me, thanks for watching to the end. I wish you the best of luck with your team selection. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again very soon.
Oh, I dropped my cheese.